On the coldest Christmas Eve Boston had seen in decades, a man who had everything met a little girl who had nothing. What she said about her mother that frozen night would shatter all his certainties, reveal a secret buried for years, and prove that some connections transcend chance. This is the story of how an abandoned child in a cemetery forever changed the fate of a millionaire who had lost the ability to feel. Get ready, because what you're about to hear will touch your heart in a way you'll never forget. Heavy snow fell over Mount Auburn Cemetery in Cambridge, Massachusetts, that afternoon of December 24, 2019. White flakes covered the ancient headstones with a silent blanket, transforming the place into a ghostly landscape. It was Christmas Eve, and the cemetery was deserted, as it should be. No one visited graves on a night like this. No one, except Richard Montgomery Sullivan. Richard parked his black Mercedes-Benz S-Class at the cemetery's side entrance, away from curious eyes. At 52 years old, he was one of the wealthiest men in New England, owner of a chain of private hospitals that stretched across 6 states. His net worth was estimated at $340 million. He had power, influence, an $8 million mansion in Beacon Hill, another in Martha's Vineyard, luxury cars, and access to Boston's most exclusive circles. But that Christmas night, Richard Sullivan was absolutely alone. He walked slowly along the snow-covered path, his hands buried in the pockets of his $3,000 Burberry coat. His Italian shoes sank into the fresh snow, but he didn't care. Each step was heavy, laden with a pain that no amount of money could heal. 23 years. It had been 23 years since he made this solitary pilgrimage on Christmas Day. The grave was in the west section, under a century-old oak tree that was now completely bare. Its dark branches stretched against the gray sky like skeletal fingers. The white marble headstone was partially covered with snow, but Richard could read the engraved words even with his eyes closed. Caroline Elizabeth Sullivan 1968–1996 beloved wife and mother, her light still shines in our hearts. Richard stopped before the grave and closed his eyes. 23 years since Caroline had died, taken by an aggressive cancer that destroyed her body in just 8 months. She was 28 years old. He was 29. They had a 3-year-old son named Thomas. A son that Richard also lost, in a different way, but equally devastating. He opened his eyes and looked at the headstone beside it. Smaller, simpler, but no less painful. Thomas Richard Sullivan 1993–2014 beloved son flew too high. Too young. Thomas was 21 when he died in a car accident in Cape Cod. He was driving at high speed, probably under the influence of drugs. Richard knew this. Everyone knew. Thomas had lost his way after his mother died, and Richard, consumed by work and grief, couldn't save him. "Merry Christmas, Caroline." "Merry Christmas, Tommy," Richard murmured, his voice breaking. I don't know how to do this anymore. I don't know how to keep coming here, year after year, pretending I'm okay. Pretending my life has meaning." Tears ran down his face, mixing with the falling snowflakes. Richard Sullivan, the man who commanded a hospital empire, who negotiated multi-million-dollar contracts, who never showed weakness, was crying alone in a cemetery on Christmas Eve. That's when he heard it. A sob. Low, muffled, but unmistakable. Richard froze. He slowly turned his head, scanning the snow-covered cemetery. There was no one. He was sure of it. Or was he? The sob came again, louder this time. It was coming from behind a marble crypt about 50 feet away. "Hello," Richard called out, quickly wiping the tears from his face. "Is someone there?" Silence. Then, another sob, followed by low, frightened crying. Richard walked toward the sound, his heart racing. When he rounded the crypt, he stopped abruptly, his brain taking a few seconds to process what he was seeing. A child. A small girl, couldn't be more than 6 or 7 years old, was huddled against the marble wall of the crypt. She was wearing a thin summer dress, a summer dress in December, torn and dirty. She had no coat. Her bare feet were purple with cold, and she was shaking violently. Her light brown hair was tangled and full of snow. But what shocked Richard most were her eyes, large, blue, terrified, looking at him as if he were a monster. "My God," Richard whispered, falling to his knees in the snow. "Child, what are you doing here? Where's your mother?" The girl shrank back even more, pressing herself against the marble wall. She was shaking so hard her teeth were chattering audibly. "I'm not going to hurt you," Richard said quickly, taking off his coat. "You're freezing. You need help." Mommy," the girl managed to say between tremors, her words almost incomprehensible. "Mommy is. Where's your mommy?" Richard asked gently, holding out the coat to her. "Is she here in the cemetery?" The girl nodded slowly, tears running down her dirty cheeks. With a trembling hand, she pointed to a simple headstone a few yards away. Richard followed her gaze and felt his heart tighten. It was a cheap headstone, almost sinking into the snow. Richard approached and cleared the snow with his hands. The engraved words were simple, almost cruelly simple. Jennifer Marie Parker, 1990 to 2019. May God receive her. The date of death was recent. Very recent. Only 3 weeks ago. Richard turned back to the girl, who was now crying silently, her eyes fixed on her mother's headstone. "What's your name?" Richard asked softly. "Emma," she whispered. "Emma Rose Parker." "Emma, sweetheart, how long have you been here?" Emma looked at him with those devastated blue eyes. I don't know. It's cold. So sea cold. Mommy said, before she left, she said God would take care of me. She said I would never be alone." Richard felt something break inside his chest. Something that had been frozen for 23 years. "Are you alone, Emma? Don't you have anyone?" The girl shook her head, and Richard saw that her lips were turning blue. "Come," he said, picking her up in his arms without waiting for permission. She was so light, so cold. "Let's get out of here. Let's warm you up." Richard carried Emma through the snow-covered cemetery, feeling the small body tremble against his chest. She was so light she seemed to weigh nothing, as if she were made of air and sadness. When he reached the Mercedes, he opened the back door and gently placed her on the seat, immediately turning the heater on full blast. "You're safe now," Richard said, taking off his own jacket and covering her with it too. "I'm going to take you somewhere warm, okay?" Emma nodded weakly, her eyes beginning to close. Richard felt a sudden panic. Hypothermia. He knew the signs. He owned hospitals, after all. She needed immediate medical attention. He grabbed his phone and dialed quickly. "Dr. Harrison. Richard Sullivan. I need you to open the private emergency room at Massachusetts General right now." "Yes, I know it's Christmas Eve. I have an emergency. A child with severe hypothermia. I'll be there in 15 minutes. As he drove through the deserted streets of Cambridge toward Boston, Richard looked in the rearview mirror at Emma, who was curled up in the back seat, shivering under the coats. Who was this child? Why was she alone in a cemetery, barefoot, on Christmas Eve? And where the hell was her family? "Emma," he called softly. "Emma, sweetheart, can you talk to me? I need you to stay awake, okay?" "I'm sleepy," she murmured. "I know, but you can't sleep yet. Tell me about your mommy. What was she like?" Emma's eyes opened slightly. "Mommy was beautiful. She sang to me every night. She said I was her angel." "I'm sure you are," Richard said, his voice choking up. "And your father? Where is he?" "I never met Daddy. Mommy said he left before I was born. It was always just me and her." Richard felt a pang in his heart. This girl had absolutely no one in the world. "And after your mother, after she went to heaven, Who took care of you? Emma was silent for a moment. Nobody. A social worker came. Said I was going to a home. But I ran away. I didn't want to leave Mommy alone. She gets scared of the dark. Richard had to blink several times to hold back tears. This child had run away from social services to stay near her mother's grave. In the Boston winter. On Christmas Eve. 40 minutes later, Emma was on a stretcher in the private emergency room of Massachusetts General Hospital, Richard's most prestigious hospital. Dr. Sarah Harrison, an experienced pediatrician Richard had known for years, was carefully examining her while nurses wrapped her in thermal blankets. Body temperature is at 89.6 degrees Fahrenheit, Dr. Harrison said, worried. A few more degrees and we would have lost her. Richard, where did you find this girl? At Mount Auburn Cemetery, Richard replied, watching as they connected and for to Emma. She was alone, wearing only a summer dress. Her mother died 3 weeks ago. Dr. Harrison shook her head, shocked. My God. She's severely malnourished too. Look at those ribs. When was the last time you ate, sweetheart? Emma looked at her with huge eyes. I don't remember. Some people leave food on graves. Sometimes I would take it. Richard felt nauseous. This child was eating offerings left on graves to survive. We're going to run some tests, Dr. Harrison said. I need to check for frostbite damage on her feet and fingers. But she's going to be okay, Richard. You saved her. Richard nodded, but he couldn't take his eyes off Emma. There was something about her, something that affected him in a way he couldn't explain. Maybe it was the blue eyes, so similar to Caroline's. Or the quiet courage, the same that Thomas had when he was little. Or maybe it was simply the fact that, for the first time in 23 years, Richard Sullivan felt he had a purpose. 2 hours later, Emma was stable, warm, and sleeping soundly in a private suite at the hospital. Richard had refused to leave. He was sitting in an armchair next to the bed, watching her small chest rise and fall under the clean blankets. Dr. Harrison entered the room quietly. She's going to be fine. There was no permanent frostbite damage, thank God. But Richard, we need to call social services. She's a missing minor. I know, Richard said, but every fiber of his being rejected the idea of turning her over to the system. But it's Christmas Eve, Sarah. Not today. Please. Dr. Harrison looked at him with compassion. She had known Richard for years, knew about Caroline and Thomas. She had never seen him like this, vulnerable, almost desperate. Until tomorrow morning, she agreed. But after that, I have no choice. When she left, Richard moved closer to the bed. Emma looked so small, so fragile under the white hospital blankets. Her brown hair was clean now, spread across the pillow. Without the dirt and fear, he could see she was beautiful. Painfully beautiful. What do I do with you, little Emma? He whispered. As if she had heard him, Emma slowly opened her eyes. For a moment, she seemed frightened, not recognizing where she was. Then she saw Richard, and something in her face relaxed. You stayed, she said, her voice hoarse. I stayed, Richard confirmed. And I'm not going anywhere. Mommy said that when she left, God was going to send someone to take care of me. She said I would know when that person arrived. Emma looked at him with those huge blue eyes. Is it you? Richard felt his heart stop. He wasn't religious. He hadn't believed in God since Caroline died. But in that moment, that Christmas night, he couldn't deny that something bigger was happening. Yes, he heard himself say. Yes, Emma. It's me. A tear ran down the girl's face, but for the first time, it wasn't a tear of sadness. You promise? Promise you won't leave me. Richard took her small hand in his. I promise. And Richard Sullivan, the man who hadn't made promises to anyone in 23 years, knew this was a promise he would keep or die trying. But what Richard didn't know, what he would discover in the coming weeks, was that Emma Rose Parker wasn't just any stranger. There was a connection between them that went far beyond that night in the cemetery. A connection that, when revealed, would change everything. Christmas morning dawned clear and cold over Boston. Richard Sullivan hadn't slept a single minute. He remained seated in that armchair, watching Emma sleep, his mind working in overdrive. For the first time in decades, he wasn't thinking about business, about money, about his hospital empire. He was thinking about how to save a child. At 8 in the morning, the room door opened and a woman entered. Tall, wearing glasses, with a folder under her arm and a stern expression on her face. Richard recognized the type immediately, bureaucracy on legs. "Mr. Sullivan," she said, her voice cold and professional. "I'm Margaret Chen, from the Massachusetts Department of Children and Families. I need to talk about Emma Parker." Richard stood up, instinctively positioning himself between the social worker and the bed where Emma was still sleeping. "It's Christmas. Can't this wait?" "No, it can't," Margaret replied, emotionless. "Emma Parker is a missing minor. She ran away from a temporary home 3 weeks ago. We've been looking for her. Now that she's been found, I need to take her back into the system." "Into the system," Richard repeated, his voice loaded with contempt. "The same system she ran away from? The same system that failed to protect her?" Margaret sighed, as if she'd had this conversation 1,000 times. "Mr. Sullivan, I understand your concern, but there are protocols. Emma needs a family. There are adoption processes that take time. Evaluations, background checks, home visits. How long?" Richard interrupted. "Excuse me. How long do these processes take?" Margaret hesitated. "Normally, between 18 months and 3 years. But in Emma's case, it might be more complicated. She has behavioral issues. She's already been returned by 2 foster families." Richard felt anger rising in his chest. Behavioral issues? She's 7 years old and just lost her mother. 6, Margaret corrected. "Emma is 6 years old. And I understand your empathy, Mr. Sullivan, I really do. But the law is clear. I can't simply hand over a child to a stranger, no matter how wealthy or well-intentioned he may be." At that moment, Emma woke up. She heard the voices and sat up in bed, her eyes immediately finding Margaret. The fear Richard saw on that small face was like a stab wound. "No," Emma said, her voice breaking. "No, please. I don't want to go back. They're mean to me. They—" "Emma, dear," Margaret began in a tone that was meant to be gentle but sounded condescending. "You know you need to go to a safe home. I want Tio stay with him." Emma screamed, pointing at Richard. Tears ran down her face. He promised he wouldn't leave me." Richard felt his heart shatter. He went to the bed and held Emma's hand. "And I won't," he said firmly, looking directly at Margaret. "I won't leave her." Margaret shook her head. "Mr. Sullivan, be reasonable. I'm filing for adoption," Richard declared. "Today. Now. And I'm going to use every resource at my disposal to expedite this process." "It doesn't work that way. I know exactly how it works," Richard interrupted her, his voice taking on that steel tone he used in boardrooms. "I own half the hospitals in this region. I know judges, politicians, people who can make things happen. And I'm going to use every connection I have." Margaret stared at him, clearly irritated. "Threats aren't going to help your cause, Mr. Sullivan. If you want to adopt Emma, you need to follow the same processes everyone follows." "Fine," Richard said. Then tell me what I need to do. But while that happens, Emma stays with me. Absolutely not. She needs ongoing medical care, Richard continued, relentless. Severe hypothermia, malnutrition. Dr. Harrison recommended at least a week of observation. This is my hospital. I can ensure she receives the best possible treatment. Or would you rather take her back to an overcrowded foster home where she'll be just another number? Margaret Chin opened her mouth, closed it, and then sighed deeply. 1 week, she finally said. She can stay here for a week while I file the paperwork. But after that, Mr. Sullivan, if you don't have preliminary approval for temporary foster care, she goes back into the system. Understood. Perfectly, Richard replied. After Margaret left, Emma threw herself into Richard's arms, sobbing. You didn't let her take me. And I never will, Richard said, hugging her tightly. He had no idea how, but he would make it work. He had to. In the following days, Richard Sullivan became an obsessed man. He hired the best family lawyers in Massachusetts. They were brutally honest with him. Mr. Sullivan, said Amanda Foster, a senior attorney from a prestigious firm, I need to be frank. Your situation isn't ideal. You're a 52-year-old single man with no recent experience with children. You don't have a wife, you don't have family support. You work 80 hours a week. A judge is going to question your ability to properly care for a 6-year-old child. So what do I do? Richard asked, frustrated. You change your life, Amanda replied simply. Reduce your working hours. Demonstrate stability. Hire a qualified nanny. Prepare your home to receive a child. And pray that no skeletons come out of your closet during the background check. Richard worked day and night. He hired a nanny, a lovely woman named Helen Morrison, with 30 years of childcare experience. He renovated an entire wing of his Beacon Hill mansion to transform it into a children's paradise. Decorated room, toys, books, everything a 6-year-old girl could want. He reduced his workload, delegating responsibilities to his vice presidents. But there was a bigger problem he hadn't anticipated. On the 5th day, while visiting Emma at the hospital, Richard found Dr. Harrison waiting in the hallway with a worried expression. Richard, we need to talk, she said, guiding him to a private room. I received the results of Emma's blood tests. We did a complete panel when she arrived, including blood typing. And? Richard asked, impatient. She's O negative, Dr. Harrison said slowly. A relatively rare blood type. Only 7% of the population has it. Okay, Richard said, not understanding why this was relevant. Richard, Dr. Harrison continued, her voice hesitant, you're also O negative. I know this because you regularly donate blood to the hospital blood bank. Richard felt something strange in his stomach. It's just a coincidence. Probably, Dr. Harrison agreed. But Richard, there's something else. Emma's mother's name was Jennifer Parker. Jennifer Marie Parker. Yes, I know. I saw the headstone. I did some research, Dr. Harrison admitted. Jennifer Parker worked as a nurse at Mass General 8 years ago. She worked here, Richard. At this hospital. At your hospital. Richard became completely still. His brain refused to process what he was hearing. You're saying that? I'm not saying anything, Dr. Harrison interrupted quickly. But I thought you should know. If there's any possibility of a genetic connection between you and Emma, it would change everything regarding the adoption. Richard sat down heavily. Jennifer Parker. The name meant nothing to him. He barely knew his employees, focused only on numbers and results. But 8 years ago, Emma was 6 years old. So Jennifer would have gotten pregnant 7 years ago. 7 years ago, Richard was in a very dark period of his life. It was the 10th anniversary of Caroline's death and the 3rd anniversary of Thomas's death. He was drinking too much, working too much, slowly destroying himself. He vaguely remembered a hospital party. He drank too much. Woke up in a hotel without remembering much. No. It wasn't possible. Or was it? Richard Sullivan couldn't get that conversation out of his head. Jennifer Parker. A nurse who worked at his hospital. Emma was 6 years old. The dates aligned perfectly with that dark period of his life he tried to forget. That night, after putting Emma to sleep, she was still in the hospital, but now in a comfortable suite that looked more like a hotel room. Richard went to the Human Resources Department. The hospital was empty, silent. He used his master key to enter the archives. It took 20 minutes to find Jennifer Marie Parker's file. When he opened the folder, his heart raced. The employee ID photo showed a young, beautiful woman with brown hair and bright blue eyes. There was something familiar about that face, but Richard couldn't be sure if he actually recognized her, or if his mind was playing tricks on him. She had worked as a nurse in the cardiology department from January 2015 to March 2018. Exemplary performance. No complaints. Then she simply resigned. No specific reason provided. Richard checked the dates again. Emma was born on July 13, 2018, according to the medical records Dr. Harrison had shared. Jennifer would have gotten pregnant in October 2017. October 2017. Richard closed his eyes, forcing his memory. October 2017 was when he hit the 3-year mark without Thomas. He remembered that month. It had been horrible. He was drinking heavily every night. There was a hospital charity gala at the end of the month. He drank so much he could barely stand. And then, nothing. A black void in his memory. He woke up at the Four Seasons Hotel in Boston the next morning, alone, with a devastating hangover and no memory of how he got there. His car was still in the hospital parking lot. He assumed he took an Uber or someone drove him. But what if that wasn't it? What if something else happened? Richard felt nausea rising. He had never cheated on Caroline, not even after she died. He considered himself someone with principles. But what if, in a moment of absolute darkness, he had done something he couldn't even remember? He picked up the phone and called a number he never thought he'd use. Gene Tech Laboratory, how may I help you? A female voice answered. I need a paternity test, Richard said, his voice hoarse. Discreet. Fast. Money is no object. 2 days later, Richard had the necessary materials. He discreetly collected a DNA sample from Emma, a few strands of hair from her brush, while she slept. His own sample was easy. He sent everything to the private laboratory with maximum priority instructions. The results would take 72 hours. While waiting, Richard was falling apart. He barely slept, barely ate. Emma noticed something was wrong. Richard? She asked one afternoon when he was visiting her. She was sitting in bed coloring. Helen, the nanny he had hired, had brought coloring books and pencils. Are you sad? No, sweetheart, Richard lied, forcing a smile. Just tired. Mommy used to get sad too, Emma said calmly, still coloring. Especially when she talked about my daddy. She said he didn't know I existed. That it was a mistake, but I wasn't a mistake. That I was the best thing that ever happened to her. Richard felt like he'd been punched in the stomach. Your mother. She talked about your father? Emma nodded. Sometimes. She said he was a good man, but he was very sad when they met. That he was lost. She said she was afraid to tell him about me because he had so many problems. Emma looked at Richard with those huge blue eyes. Do you think he wanted me? My daddy. Richard had to turn his face away, pretending to look out the window. Tears burned his eyes. I'm sure he did, Emma. I'm sure that if he had known about you, he would have loved you more than anything in the world. But would he have? Richard thought. If Jennifer had actually told him about the pregnancy, how would he have reacted? He was so lost back then, so destroyed by the loss of Caroline and Thomas. Would he have been a good father? Or would he have pushed Jennifer and Emma away, like he pushed everyone away? On the third day, while Richard was in a tense meeting with Margaret Chen and his lawyers about the adoption process, his phone vibrated. A message from Gene Tech Laboratory. Results available. Access your secure portal. Richard felt his hands tremble. He excused himself from the meeting, ignoring Margaret's protests, and locked himself in his private office at the hospital. With shaking fingers, he accessed the portal and opened the PDF file. Paternity test, results alleged father, Richard Montgomery Sullivan child, Emma Rose Parker probability of paternity, 99.9999% conclusion. Richard Montgomery Sullivan is biologically the father of Emma Rose Parker with virtual certainty. Richard dropped the phone as if it were on fire. The device fell to the floor with a crash, but he barely noticed. He was staring at his hands, which were trembling uncontrollably. Emma was his daughter. His daughter. He had a daughter. For 6 years, he had a daughter in the world and didn't know it. Jennifer Parker got pregnant by him, worked at the same hospital as him, had a baby, his daughter, and never told him. Why? Out of fear. Because she thought he wouldn't care? To protect Emma from him? And then Jennifer died. And Emma was alone. Alone, starving, freezing in a cemetery on Christmas Eve, while her father, was just yards away, crying for a family he thought he'd lost completely. But he hadn't lost everything. He had a daughter. She was alive. She was here. Richard didn't realize he was crying until he felt tears dripping on his hands. He fell to his knees on his office floor and sobbed like he hadn't sobbed since the day of Thomas's funeral. But this time they weren't just tears of sadness. They were tears of relief, of shock, of a terrifying joy. He had a second chance. A chance to be a father again. A chance to get it right. But how would he tell Emma? How would he explain that the man who found her in the cemetery was actually the father she never knew? That her mother died without ever telling her the truth? And Margaret Chen. My God, Margaret Chen. She was making the adoption process hell, questioning every aspect of Richard's life, every decision he'd ever made. But if he revealed he was Emma's biological father, that would change everything. Or make everything worse. Richard picked up the phone from the floor and called Amanda Foster, his lawyer. Amanda, he said, his voice breaking. I need to see you. Now. Everything has changed. An hour later, Amanda was sitting across from Richard in his office, reading the paternity test results. Her face was pale. Richard, she finally said, do you understand what this means? It means Emma is my daughter, Richard replied. It means I don't need to adopt her. She's already mine. No, Amanda said slowly. It's not that simple. Legally, you were never recognized as Emma's father. You're not on the birth certificate. Jennifer never established paternity. You didn't pay child support. You had no involvement in Emma's life for the past 6 years. Because I didn't know. I understand that, Amanda interrupted. But from a legal standpoint, you're a stranger trying to claim paternity of a 6-year-old child after the mother's death. Margaret Chen and the Department of Children and Families are going to investigate thoroughly. They're going to question why Jennifer never told you. They're going to question the circumstances of Emma's conception. Richard went rigid. What do you mean? Amanda looked him directly in the eyes. Richard, do you remember that night? The night Emma was conceived? Because if you don't remember, and if there's any suggestion that Jennifer was incapacitated or that you were, this could get very complicated. Richard felt the floor disappear beneath his feet. He didn't remember. He had a black void. What if Jennifer couldn't consent either? What if they were both too drunk? What if? Could this be used against me? He asked, horrified. It could, Amanda confirmed. Or it could be the key to you getting full custody of Emma. But Richard, you need to decide. Reveal the truth now and risk devastating scrutiny, or continue with the adoption process as planned and tell Emma when she's legally yours. Richard looked out the window at the city of Boston below. Somewhere in that hospital his daughter, was waiting for him, trusting him. He had to make the right choice. But for the first time in his life, Richard Sullivan didn't know what the right choice was. Richard Sullivan didn't sleep that night. He stayed in his office until dawn, looking at the paternity test results, wrestling with the most important decision of his life. Revealing the truth could destroy everything. Margaret Chen was already looking for reasons to deny his ability to care for Emma. If she discovered the murky circumstances of the conception, if she questioned why Jennifer never told Richard about the pregnancy, she could easily argue that Richard was inadequate as a father. But hiding the truth felt like a betrayal. To Emma, to Jennifer, and to himself. At 6 a.m, he made his decision. He would tell Emma first. She deserved to know. Then, together, they would face whatever came next. Richard entered Emma's room at 9 a.m. She was sitting in bed, watching cartoons on TV, still in her pajamas. Helen, the nanny, was organizing new clothes Richard had bought. Dresses, pants, colorful blouses, all of the best quality. Emma, Richard said softly, can we talk? Just the two of us. Emma looked at him with those blue eyes. My eyes, Richard thought with a squeeze in his heart, and nodded. Helen understood the cue and discreetly left the room. Richard sat on the edge of the bed, and Emma snuggled up beside him. She had become so comfortable with him in recent days. So trusting. That made everything even harder. Emma, sweetheart, Richard began, his voice trembling slightly. I need to tell you something very important. Something about your mommy, and about me. Emma looked at him, curious but unafraid. What? Richard took a deep breath. You remember when you told me that your mommy said your daddy didn't know you existed? That he was a good man, but he was very sad. Emma nodded slowly. I had some tests done. Special tests. And I found out something that... Richard felt the words stuck in his throat. Emma, I'm your father. I'm the man your mother talked about. The silence that followed was deafening. Emma stared at him, blinking slowly, as if trying to process words in a foreign language. You're my daddy, she finally whispered. Yes, Richard said, tears running down his face. I am. I didn't know, Emma. Your mother never told me, and I don't know why, but you're my daughter. You've always been my daughter. Emma continued staring at him, her face impossible to read. Then, to Richard's horror, tears began running down her cheeks. Emma, Mommy lied, Emma said, her voice breaking. Mommy said Daddy didn't want to meet me. That he had gone away. But you were here. Here all along. She didn't lie, sweetheart, Richard said quickly, taking Emma's small hands. She was protecting you. I was in a very dark place when I met your mother. I was very sad, very lost. Maybe she thought I couldn't be a good father to you. Maybe she was afraid. But would you have loved me? Emma asked, and the vulnerable hope in that voice destroyed Richard. If you had known about me, would you have loved me? Richard pulled Emma into his arms, hugging her tightly. I would have loved you from the first second. I would have moved mountains for you. I would have been the best father I could be. And now that I know I will be. I promise, Emma, you'll never be alone again. Never again. Emma sobbed against his chest, her small fists gripping Richard's shirt. You're going to take me away? Will I live with you? For real. For real, Richard promised. You're my daughter. No one is going to separate us. No one. But even as he made that promise, Richard knew the battle was just beginning. Margaret Chen arrived 2 hours later, accompanied by a supervisor and a child protection officer. Their faces were serious, their steps determined. Richard knew immediately that something was wrong. Mr. Sullivan, Margaret said, her voice icy, I need to speak with you. In private. They gathered in a conference room. Margaret placed a heavy folder on the table and opened it, revealing a stack of documents. We received an anonymous complaint this morning, she began. Someone claiming you have inappropriate motivations for adopting Emma Parker. That you knew her mother. That there may be improper connections. Richard felt his blood freeze. Who made this complaint? It's anonymous, Margaret repeated. But we're required to investigate. So, Mr. Sullivan, I'm going to ask directly. Did you know Jennifer Parker? Richard looked at his lawyers, who were present. Amanda gave a small nod. It was time for the truth. Yes, Richard said. I knew her. She worked at my hospital. And I have proof that I'm Emma's biological father. The silence in the room was absolute. Margaret stared at him, shocked. The supervisor leaned forward. The child protection officer picked up a pen, ready to take notes. You have proof? Margaret finally asked. Richard slid the paternity test results across the table. DNA test. 99.9999% certainty. Emma is my daughter. Margaret read the documents, her expression moving from shock to suspicion. Mr. Sullivan, if you knew you were Emma's father, why didn't you come forward before? Why did you let a 6-year-old child in the system, suffering in foster homes? Because I didn't know, Richard said, his voice firm. Jennifer never told me about the pregnancy. Never gave me the chance to be Emma's father. I only found out after finding her in the cemetery, when I had the test done. Why didn't Jennifer tell you? The supervisor asked. This seems convenient. A mother doesn't tell the father about a child, the father is a millionaire, the mother dies, and suddenly he shows up claiming paternity. I don't know why she didn't tell me, Richard admitted. Maybe because the circumstances of conception weren't ideal. I was going through a very difficult time. I had lost my wife and my son. I was drinking heavily. Maybe Jennifer thought I wouldn't be a good father. And the circumstances of conception? Margaret asked, her eyes narrowing. How exactly was Emma conceived, Mr. Sullivan? Richard swallowed hard. I don't remember that night clearly. There was a hospital party. I drank too much. I don't remember what happened between Jennifer and me. You don't remember? Margaret repeated slowly. Mr. Sullivan, are you saying Emma was conceived during an encounter you have no memory of? I was drunk, Richard said, feeling control of the situation slip through his fingers. Not criminally, but enough that some hours of that night are hazy. And Jennifer? The protection officer asked. Was she also drunk? I don't know, Richard admitted. I don't remember. Margaret closed the folder forcefully. Mr. Sullivan, this significantly complicates things. You're admitting you don't have clear memory of Emma's conception. That alcohol was involved. That Emma's mother chose not to inform you about the pregnancy for the next 6 years, until her death. From a legal and ethical standpoint, this raises serious questions. I'm her father, Richard said, his voice desperate. The DNA proves it. The DNA proves you're the biological father, Margaret corrected. It doesn't prove you'd be a good father. It doesn't prove Emma would be better off with you than with a stable family that wants her and has gone through all the proper processes. She wants me, Richard said. Emma wants to stay with me. Ask her. What a 6-year-old child wants isn't necessarily what's best for her, Margaret said coldly. Mr. Sullivan, I'm going to be honest. This revelation, combined with the anonymous complaint, has created serious concerns. I'm going to recommend that Emma be removed from your custody immediately and placed in a foster home while we thoroughly investigate this situation. No. Richard stood up abruptly. You're not taking her. She's my daughter. A daughter you didn't know about a week ago, Margaret replied. A daughter whose mother chose not to involve you in her life. Mr. Sullivan, I need to think of Emma's best interest, and at the moment, I'm not convinced that being with you is in that interest. Amanda stood up too. Ms. Chin, my client just discovered he has a daughter. He's doing everything right. He wants to be her father. He has resources to care for her. He has financial resources, Margaret interrupted. But financial resources don't make a father. And given the suspicious circumstances of the situation, I'm going to recommend immediate removal. A hearing will be scheduled for next week. Richard felt the world crumbling around him. You can't do this. I can and I will, Margaret said, picking up her folder. Emma will be transferred to a foster home this afternoon. You can say goodbye to her, but after that, Mr. Sullivan, you'll have no contact until the hearing. I'm her father, Richard shouted. But Margaret Chen was already leaving the room, leaving Richard desperate, destroyed, and for the second time in his life, about to lose a daughter. Richard ran through the hospital corridors, his heart pounding in his chest. He needed to get to Emma before Margaret Chen did. He needed to explain, he needed to say goodbye, he needed to, my God, he needed to stop this from happening. When he reached the room, Emma was playing with a dollhouse that Helen had brought. She looked up when Richard entered, and the smile that lit up her face was like a knife to his heart. Daddy, she said. It was the first time she'd called him that. Look, Helen gave me a dollhouse. It has 3 floors and... She stopped when she saw the expression on his face. The smile slowly disappeared. What happened? She asked, her voice getting small. You're crying. Richard knelt in front of her, taking her small hands. How did he say this? How did he destroy her world again? Emma, sweetheart, he began, his voice breaking. Something happened. Ms. Chen, she thinks you need to go to a temporary home for a while. While they investigate whether I can be your father. Emma stared at him, confused. But you are my father. You said so. I know, Richard said quickly. But they need to be sure. They need to do paperwork, investigations. It's complicated, sweetheart. No. Emma screamed, tears already running down her face. No, you promised. You promised you wouldn't leave me. You lied. I didn't lie, Richard said, pulling her into his arms as she struggled. Emma, listen, I'm going to fight for you. I'm going to do everything I can to bring you back. But for now. No. Emma screamed again, now sobbing. I don't want to go. They're mean to me in the homes. They yell, please, Daddy, please don't let me go. The word, Daddy, coming from that small mouth completely destroyed Richard. He hugged Emma tightly, crying with her, feeling more powerless than he'd ever felt in his entire life. I'm sorry, he whispered into her hair. I'm sorry, my love. I'm going to bring you back. I promise. But as he held his crying daughter, Richard knew that promises meant nothing against the bureaucracy of the system. It was Helen who changed everything. The nanny was in the corner of the room, silent tears running down her face as she watched the devastating scene. Then, Suddenly, she remembered something. Mr. Sullivan, she said abruptly. Emma's things. The clothes she was wearing when you found her. Where are they? Richard looked at her, confused. In the closet, I think. Why? I was organizing everything yesterday, Helen said, quickly going to the closet. The dress was torn and dirty, but I felt something in the pocket. I didn't get to see what it was because I was interrupted. She pulled out the thin, torn dress Emma was wearing that cold night in the cemetery. With careful fingers, she searched the pocket and pulled out something. An envelope. Old, yellowed, crumpled, but still intact. Emma, Helen said gently, is this yours? Emma looked through her tears and nodded. Mommy gave it to me. Before she went to the hospital the last time. She said it was very important. That I needed to keep it always. But I can't read very well yet. Richard took the envelope with trembling hands. On the outside, in delicate feminine handwriting, was written, for Richard Sullivan. For when he knows. The world stopped. Jennifer left this for you, Helen whispered. With shaking fingers, Richard opened the envelope. Inside were 3 handwritten pages and a photo. Richard looked at the photo first and his heart stopped. It was Jennifer, pregnant, smiling softly at the camera. And beside her, with his arm around her shoulders, was Richard. He remembered that shirt, that day. It was the hospital party. And they were smiling, looking happy, as if they were a couple. But he didn't remember. He didn't remember anything about that photo. With trembling hands, Richard began to read the letter. Dear Richard, if you're reading this, then I'm gone, and my Emma has finally found you. I always knew she would. God has a plan, and the plan was always for the 2 of you to meet when the time was right. You must be confused. You must be wondering why I never told you about Emma. Why I deprived you of 6 years with your daughter. Let me explain. That night, at the hospital party in October 2017, you were destroyed. You had drunk too much, you were crying alone in the hotel garden. I was getting off my shift and I saw you. I talked to you. You told me about Caroline, about Thomas. About how you had lost everything and saw no reason to continue. Richard, you were in so much pain. And I fell in love with you that night. With your honest pain, with your humanity. We talked for hours. You cried in my arms. And then, something happened between us. Something sweet, something gentle, something we both needed. The next morning, you didn't remember. You were embarrassed, confused. You apologized to me repeatedly, thinking you had taken advantage of me. But Richard, you didn't take advantage of anything. I wanted to be with you. I wanted to comfort you. When I found out I was pregnant, my first instinct was to tell you. But then I watched you. You were sinking deeper into depression. You were drinking more. You were destroying yourself. And I realized, if I told you about the baby in that state, you might destroy yourself completely. Or worse, you might reject our daughter, and she would grow up feeling she wasn't wanted. So I made a decision. I would care for her alone. I would love her enough for both of us. And when the time was right, when you were healed, God would find a way to bring you together. Richard, I forgave you for not remembering that night. You were lost. You weren't yourself. And I don't regret anything, because that night gave me Emma, and she is the most precious thing that has ever existed. Now I'm sick. Very sick. The doctors say I don't have much time. And I know Emma will be alone. But I'm not afraid, because I know you're going to find her. I know that, somehow, you'll connect. And when that happens, you're going to love her like I love her. Emma is strong. Like you. She's kind, like Caroline was. You talked a lot about her that night. She has your smile, Richard. And your eyes. Every time I look at her, I see you. Please, be the father I know you can be. Not the lost and broken man I met in 2017, but the man you were meant to be. Emma needs you. And I think you need her too. Love our daughter, Richard. Protect her. Give her the life I can no longer give. With love and hope, Jennifer Marie Parker P.S. There's a flash drive sewn into the hem of Emma's dress. On it, there are videos. Videos of me explaining everything to the authorities, in case you need to prove that Emma is yours and that I wanted you to be her father. Use them if necessary. I fought for my life as much as I could, but now I'm fighting for hers. And I place that fight in your hands. Richard let the letter fall from his hands, sobs shaking his entire body. Jennifer. Sweet, kind Jennifer, who loved him on his worst night, who carried his secret to protect him, who raised Emma alone because she believed that one day he would be ready. And she was right. If Jennifer had told him about the pregnancy in 2017, Richard probably would have self-destructed. He wasn't ready. But now he was. Helen, he said, his voice hoarse. Find that flash drive. Now. 2 minutes later, Helen found the small flash drive carefully sewn into the hem of the dress. Richard connected it to his laptop. There were 3 videos. All dated 2 weeks before Jennifer died, when she already knew she wouldn't beat the cancer. Richard opened the first video and saw Jennifer, pale, thin, clearly sick, but with determined eyes, looking directly at the camera. My name is Jennifer Marie Parker. Today is November 29th, 2019. I'm recording this as legal testimony. Richard Montgomery Sullivan is the biological father of my daughter, Emma Rose Parker. He doesn't know about Emma because I chose not to tell him. Richard watched all 3 videos, tears running down his face. Jennifer explained everything, the circumstances of conception, her decision not to tell him, her wish for Richard to be Emma's guardian after her death. When Margaret Chen arrived at the room 15 minutes later, ready to take Emma, Richard was waiting for her. With Jennifer's letter in one hand and the laptop with the videos in the other. Ms. Chen, Richard said, his voice firm for the first time in days. You need to see this. Before you take my daughter, you need to see this. And as Margaret watched Jennifer's videos, her expression slowly changing from suspicion to understanding, Emma clung to Richard's hand. This time, he wasn't going to let her go. No matter what it cost. Margaret Chen watched all 3 videos in absolute silence. When the last one ended, she closed the laptop slowly and stood still for a long moment, processing everything she had seen and heard. Jennifer Parker was a remarkable woman, Margaret finally said, her voice soft for the first time since Richard had met her. She loved Emma more than anything. And she believed in you, Mr. Sullivan. So you're not going to take her? Richard asked, his voice tense. Margaret sighed deeply. The videos changed things significantly. Jennifer clearly wanted you to be Emma's guardian. She explained the circumstances, provided context. This is no longer a case of a stranger trying to claim a child. It's a father who was, for the reasons Jennifer explained, kept in the dark. So Emma can stay with me? For now, Margaret said carefully. I still need to do a complete evaluation. I need to ensure you can provide a stable home. But Mr. Sullivan, for the first time since we started this process, I'm optimistic. Jennifer trusted you. Maybe I should too. Richard felt his knees almost give out with relief. Emma, who was clinging to his hand, started to cry, but this time they were tears of joy. I can stay, she whispered. For real, Richard said, picking her up in his arms. You're coming home with me. To our home. 3 days later, on the morning of December 30th, Richard Sullivan brought his daughter home for the first time. The Beacon Hill mansion had been transformed. What was once a cold, minimalist residence, full of modern art and marble surfaces, now had an entire wing dedicated to Emma. Her room was fit for a princess. Walls painted soft pink, a canopy bed, shelves filled with books and toys, a play area with a giant dollhouse. But when Emma saw everything, she didn't run to the toys or the beautiful bed. Instead, she looked at Richard with big, frightened eyes. "It's too big," she whispered. "What if I get lost?" Richard knelt beside her. "Then I'll find you. Always. This is your home now, Emma. You'll never get lost here." But adapting wasn't easy. That first night, Richard discovered that Emma had nightmares. She woke up screaming at 3 in the morning, calling for her mother. Richard ran to her room and found her curled up in bed, trembling. "Mommy," she cried. "I want my mommy." Richard sat on the bed and pulled her into his arms. "I know, sweetheart. I know you miss her. I miss people I loved too. But they never really leave us. They live here." He placed his hand over Emma's heart. "Your mommy is here. Always. You miss people too?" Emma asked in a small voice. "Yes," Richard admitted. "I miss my wife, Caroline, and my son, Thomas. They've been gone for a long time, but I still think about them every day." Emma looked at him with those curious blue eyes. "Were they my family too? Did I have a sister or brother?" Richard felt tears burn his eyes. "Thomas was your half-brother. He would have loved you so much. He always wanted a little sister. What was he like?" And then, for the first time in 10 years, Richard talked about Thomas. Not the troubled, destroyed version who died driving on drugs, but the real Thomas. The boy who loved astronomy, who laughed loudly, who asked impossible questions, who hugged too tight. Emma listened to every word, absorbing the story of a brother she would never know. And when Richard finished, she said something that completely destroyed him. "So I'm not your first daughter. But can I be your second chance at being a dad?" Richard hugged Emma so tight he was afraid of hurting her. "You're my second chance at everything, Emma. Everything." They slept together that night, Emma curled up against Richard's chest, finally safe, finally home. The following days were a journey of discovery for both of them. Richard, who hadn't cared for a child in over a decade, was relearning everything. How to do braids in hair, he was terrible at it. How to read stories with funny voices, Emma laughed at his terrible dragon impression. How to make heart-shaped pancakes, the kitchen became a mess. Helen helped, of course, but Richard insisted on doing things himself. He wanted every moment. He wanted every memory. Emma, in turn, was learning what it was to have a father. Someone who picked her up when she fell. Someone who checked under the bed to chase away monsters. Someone who said, "I love you," without her asking. But not everything was easy. Emma had scars. She panicked when Richard left the house, even for an hour. She ate too fast, as if the food would disappear. She hid food under the bed, just in case. "Emma," Richard said gently one afternoon when he found cookies hidden in the closet, "you don't need to do this. There will always be food. Always. You promise?" she asked, and the doubt in her voice broke his heart. "I promise," he said. "You'll never go hungry again. You'll never be cold again. You'll never be alone again." On New Year's Day, Richard took Emma to visit the cemetery. She asked to. She wanted to introduce Daddy to Mommy. They stood before Jennifer's grave, now covered by a beautiful new headstone that Richard had commissioned. Emma placed fresh flowers, daisies, Jennifer's favorites according to Emma. "Hi, Mommy," Emma said softly. "I found him. You were right. Daddy is good. He loves me, like you said he would." Richard had to bite his lip to keep from crying. "Mommy," Emma continued, "thank you for keeping me. Thank you for loving me. And thank you for giving me to Daddy. I'm going to be happy. I promise. Afterward, Richard took Emma to visit Caroline's and Thomas's graves. Emma was quiet, looking at the headstones. Would they have liked me? She finally asked. They would have loved you, Richard said with certainty. Thomas would have taught you about stars. Caroline would have made you laugh. They would have loved you as much as I love you. Emma took his hand. So I have a big family. Some of them are just in heaven. Yes, Richard agreed. A very big family. And all of them are proud of you. As they left the cemetery, the same cemetery where they met on that cold Christmas night, Richard looked back one last time. Somehow, he knew Jennifer was watching. Somehow, he knew she was smiling. Thank you, he whispered to the wind. Thank you for giving me this chance. For giving us this chance. And the wind whispered back, carrying soft snow, as if Jennifer were answering, Take good care of our girl. Always, Richard promised. Forever. But their journey was far from over. Margaret Chen had given Richard a chance, but the final custody hearing was still scheduled for mid-January. And Richard knew there would be challenges ahead. Emma had traumas to overcome. Richard had to learn to be a father again. They had to learn to be a family. But for the first time in 23 years, Richard Sullivan had something to live for. Something to fight for. He had his daughter. And he wasn't going to waste this second chance. January arrived bringing heavy snow and freezing temperatures to Boston. But inside the Sullivan mansion in Beacon Hill, there was warmth. For the first time in decades, that enormous house wasn't just expensive property. It was a home. Richard woke up every day at 6 in the morning, not to go to the office, but to prepare Emma's breakfast. Heart-shaped pancakes became his specialty, although Helen always had to help when they started to burn. Emma started attending Kingsley Academy, an elite private school in Cambridge. On the first day, she was terrified. What if the other kids don't like me? She asked, gripping Richard's hand in the school parking lot. What if they find out that I lived in the cemetery? Richard knelt in front of her, adjusting her new school uniform. Emma, any kid who doesn't like you doesn't know you. You're brave, smart, kind. Anyone would be lucky to be your friend. But I'm behind, Emma said, her voice small. The other kids already know how to read much better than me. Mommy taught me at home, but she got sick and couldn't teach anymore. Richard's heart tightened. Jennifer had homeschooled Emma because she probably didn't have money for a school. And when she got sick, Emma lost even that. Then we'll work on it together, Richard said. Every night, we'll read. And if you need extra help, I'll get the best tutors. But Emma, you're going to surprise everyone. I know it. And she did surprise them. Emma's teacher, Mrs. Martinez, called Richard after a week. Mr. Sullivan, she said, her voice emotional, I need to talk about Emma. She has gaps in her education, yes, but her intelligence is exceptional. And more importantly, she has a resilience I rarely see in 6-year-old children. She wants to learn. She tries so hard. Richard felt pride swell in his chest. She's special. She is, Mrs. Martinez agreed. But Mr. Sullivan, can I make a suggestion? Emma mentioned some things, about where she was living before. I think she could benefit from talking to someone. A child therapist. Richard had already thought about this. That same week, Emma started seeing Dr. Patricia Reeves, a child psychologist specializing in trauma and grief. The therapy sessions weren't easy. Emma had frequent nightmares. She still panicked when Richard was gone for too long. She had breakdowns when she saw other children with their mothers. One afternoon, Richard received an urgent call from the school. Emma had had a complete breakdown during a Mother's Day activity the children were preparing. When Richard arrived, he found Emma curled up under a table in the classroom, crying uncontrollably. "Emma, sweetheart," he said softly, kneeling beside the table. "It's me. Daddy's here." "Everyone has a mom," Emma sobbed. "Everyone except me. And the teacher said to make a card, and I don't have anyone to give it to." Richard felt tears burn his eyes. He slid under the table beside her and pulled her into his arms. "You have your mommy," he said gently. "She's not here physically, but she's always with you. And you know what we can do? We can make 2 cards. One for your mommy, and we'll take it to the cemetery. And one for me, because even though I'm daddy, I also take care of you like a mother would." Emma looked at him through her tears. "You would do that? Be my daddy and my mommy?" "Emma, I would do anything for you," Richard said. "Anything." That day, Richard took Emma home early. They made 2 cards. One pink, decorated with hand-drawn flowers, for Jennifer. Another blue, with stars, because Emma learned that Thomas loved astronomy, for Richard. When Emma gave him the card, Richard read the message she had written with Helen's help, to the best daddy in the world. "Thank you for finding me. Thank you for loving me. You saved my life. I love you to the moon and back. Emma." Richard couldn't hold back his tears. He hugged Emma and cried, and she hugged him back, saying, "It's okay to cry, Daddy. Mommy used to say tears clean the heart." But the challenges continued. The custody hearing was approaching, scheduled for January 15th. Margaret Chen was making regular home visits, evaluating everything: the house, Emma's routine, Richard's interactions with her, his ability to balance work and fatherhood. Richard knew that one slip could cost him Emma. And then came the hardest test. It was a Friday night. Richard was working in his home office. He had drastically reduced his hours, but still had responsibilities. Emma was playing in the living room with Helen. Then Richard heard a scream of real terror. He ran to the living room and found Emma on the floor, trembling violently, her eyes wide but seeing nothing. Helen was kneeling beside her, clearly terrified. "She just collapsed," Helen said. "She was playing normally, and then—" "Emma!" Richard shouted, picking her up in his arms. Her body was rigid, her eyes still empty. "Emma, look at me. It's me, Daddy." But Emma didn't respond. It was as if she were trapped somewhere distant, somewhere dark. Richard grabbed his phone and called Dr. Reeves, who answered immediately. "She's having a dissociative episode," the psychologist explained. "It's a trauma response. Something triggered her. Mr. Sullivan, you need to stay calm. Speak to her in a soft voice. Remind her where she is, that she's safe." Richard held Emma, rocking her gently. "Emma, you're at home. You're with me. You're safe. No one's going to hurt you. Daddy's here. Daddy won't let anything bad happen." He repeated this for 20 minutes. 20 agonizing minutes while Emma remained rigid and absent. And then, slowly, she began to come back. Her eyes focused. She saw Richard. And she started to cry. "Daddy," she sobbed. I saw Mommy in the hospital. She was calling for me and I couldn't help. I couldn't save her." "Oh, sweetheart," Richard said, his heart breaking. "You didn't have to save her. You were just a baby. It wasn't your responsibility." "But I promised to stay with her," Emma cried. "I promised not to leave her alone, and I did. I came to live with you and left her alone in that cold place." Richard held Emma's face between his hands. "Listen. Your mommy wants you to be here. She didn't want you to stay in the cemetery. She wanted you to live, to be happy, to be loved. Staying with me isn't abandoning her. It's fulfilling her wish." "Are you sure?" Emma asked, her voice so small and broken. I'm absolutely sure, Richard said. And you know how I know? Because she left me that letter. She planned everything so I would find you. She knew you would need a daddy. And she chose me. She chose us. Emma hugged Richard tightly, and he held her while she cried. Helen discreetly left the room, leaving them alone. That night, Richard slept on the floor beside Emma's bed, his hand holding hers, because she was afraid to close her eyes. Will you sing to me? Emma asked. Mommy always sang. Richard hadn't sung since Caroline died. But for Emma, he would do anything. With a hoarse and off-key voice, he sang You Are My Sunshine, the same song he used to sing to Thomas when he was little. And Emma, hearing that imperfect but love-filled voice, finally fell asleep. The next day, Margaret Chen made a surprise visit. It was Helen who received her, explaining the previous night's episode. Margaret went to find Richard in the kitchen, preparing Emma's breakfast. He had deep circles under his eyes, clearly exhausted. Mr. Sullivan, Margaret said, her voice cautious. We need to talk. Richard turned, his heart sinking. Here it was. She was going to take Emma from him. She was going to say he couldn't handle it, that Emma needed professional care, that, you slept on the floor of her room all night, didn't you? Margaret said. Richard nodded slowly. She was scared. I wasn't going to leave her alone. Margaret was silent for a moment. Then, surprisingly, she smiled. Mr. Sullivan, that's exactly the kind of thing a father does. When I first came here, I didn't think you were ready. I thought you were just a rich man trying to fix his conscience. But I was wrong. Richard blinked. You were. You love Emma, Margaret said simply. Not perfectly, not without challenges, but genuinely. And she loves you. And sometimes, Mr. Sullivan, that's all that matters. So, the hearing? I'm going to recommend that full custody be granted to you, Margaret said. Emma Rose Parker belongs with Richard Sullivan. She always has. Richard felt his knees almost give out with relief. Thank you, he whispered. Thank you. Margaret placed a hand on his shoulder. Don't thank me. Just keep being the father she needs. Keep fighting for her. And Mr. Sullivan, you're doing an incredible job. When Margaret left, Richard went upstairs and entered Emma's room. She was waking up, rubbing her eyes. Daddy, she murmured. I'm here, sweetheart, he said, sitting on the bed. And I have news. Good or bad? The best news possible, Richard said, his voice breaking with emotion. You're going to stay with me. Forever. Officially. You're going to be Emma Sullivan. Emma stared at him for a moment, and then she threw herself into his arms, laughing and crying at the same time. Forever, she repeated. Forever, Richard promised. And this time, he knew nothing could break that promise. The morning of January 15, 2020, dawned cold in Boston. Richard woke up before the alarm, his stomach churning with nervousness. Today was the day of the final custody hearing. The day that would determine whether Emma would stay with him or be placed back in the system. He went to Emma's room and found her already awake, sitting on the bed, wearing the blue dress they had bought especially for the hearing. Are you scared? Emma asked when she saw him in the doorway. A little, Richard admitted, sitting beside her. Are you? A lot, Emma said, her voice trembling. What if the judge says I can't stay? What if he says you're not good enough to be my daddy? Richard pulled her into his arms. Emma, no matter what happens today, I'm going to fight for you. And if for some crazy reason the judge decides against us, I'll appeal. I'll fight to the end. You understand. I'm not going to give up on you. Never. Emma held his hand tightly. I'm not going to give up on you either, Daddy. Suffolk County Courthouse was crowded when they arrived. Amanda Foster, Richard's lawyer, met them on the steps. Are you ready? She asked. As ready as we can be, Richard replied. Inside the courtroom, Richard saw familiar faces. Helen was there, to testify if necessary. Dr. Sarah Harrison too. Dr. Patricia Reeves, Emma's psychologist. And even Mrs. Martinez, Emma's teacher. Everyone had come to support them. Everyone was there for Emma. Margaret Chen was sitting on the other side, but when she made eye contact with Richard, she gave him a small encouraging nod. She had promised to recommend in his favor, but Richard knew the final decision belonged to the judge. Judge Harold Brennan entered, a 70-year-old man with white hair and a stern expression. Richard felt his stomach tighten. Court is in session, the judge announced. Case number 2020, JV 00847, the matter of custody of Emma Rose Parker. The next 2 hours were the most agonizing of Richard's life. Amanda presented the case methodically, the DNA test results, Jennifer's letter, the videos, Margaret Chen's evaluations, the reports from school and the psychologist. Then it was Margaret Chen's turn to testify. She took the stand with confidence. Ms. Chen, Judge Brennan said, you are the social worker assigned to this case. What is your recommendation? Margaret took a deep breath. Your Honor, when I met Richard Sullivan, I was skeptical. Very skeptical. He was a single man, 52 years old, who worked 80 hours a week and had no recent experience with children. But in the past 3 weeks, I've witnessed a transformation. She turned to look at Richard. Mr. Sullivan didn't just reduce his working hours, he restructured his entire life around Emma. He learns how to do braids on YouTube. He reads bedtime stories even when he's exhausted. He sleeps on the floor when she has nightmares. He's not trying to be a perfect father, Your Honor. He's being a real father. Margaret paused. And more importantly, Emma thrives with him. For the first time since I met her, she smiles. She laughs. She has hope. My recommendation, Your Honor, is that full custody be granted to Richard Montgomery Sullivan. Judge Brennan made notes in silence. Dr. Reeves, he called. You are the child's psychologist. What is your assessment? Dr. Reeves took the stand. Your Honor, Emma has suffered significant trauma. The loss of her mother, the time she spent alone and hungry, the instability. These things leave marks. But since she's been with Mr. Sullivan, I've seen remarkable progress. Emma still has nightmares, still has difficult moments, but she's healing. And she's healing because she has a secure foundation. She has someone who loves her unconditionally. The judge turned to Emma. Emma, can you come up here, dear? Emma looked at Richard, frightened. He nodded encouragingly. With trembling legs, Emma took the stand. She looked so small in that big chair. Emma, Judge Brennan said, his voice surprisingly gentle, you don't need to be afraid. I just want to ask some questions, okay? Emma nodded. Are you happy living with Mr. Sullivan? Yes, Emma said in a small voice. Very happy. Do you feel safe with him? Yes. Daddy protects me. He chases away the monsters and he says he loves me every day. And do you love him? Emma looked directly at Richard, her blue eyes shining. I love him more than anything in the whole world. He saved me. When Mommy went to heaven, I thought I was going to die alone. But then God sent Daddy. And now I have a family again. Judge Brennan cleared his throat, clearly moved. Thank you, Emma. You can go back to your seat. Emma got down and ran to Richard, who hugged her tight. The judge studied his documents for a long time. The silence in the courtroom was absolute. Richard could hear his own heart beating. Finally, Judge Brennan spoke. "This is an unusual case," he began. "A father who didn't know his daughter existed. A mother who chose to keep this secret for reasons that, after reviewing the evidence, I understand and respect. A child who has suffered terrible losses in her short life." He paused, and Richard felt like he was going to throw up from nervousness. But this is also a case of second chances. Of connections that, although unexpected, are undeniably real. Of a man who chose to change his entire life for a child. And of a child who, against all odds, found her way back to her father. The judge looked directly at Richard. "Mr. Sullivan, being a father isn't about being perfect. It's about being present. It's about loving when it's hard, about fighting when it's easier to give up, about putting someone else's needs above your own. By the evidence presented, you have done all these things." The judge's gavel struck. Full and permanent custody of Emma Rose Parker is granted to Richard Montgomery Sullivan, effective immediately. Furthermore, I authorize the legal name change of the child to Emma Rose Sullivan, if she so desires. The courtroom exploded in applause. Helen was crying. Dr. Harrison was smiling. Margaret Chen was discreetly wiping tears from her eyes. But Richard could only look at Emma. His daughter. His forever. "Did we win?" Emma whispered, as if she couldn't believe it. "We won," Richard said, his voice breaking. "You're mine now. Officially. Forever." Emma threw herself into his arms, laughing and crying at the same time. "I have a daddy. I have a daddy forever." That night, Richard organized a small celebration at home. Helen made a huge cake. Dr. Harrison brought gifts. Even Margaret Chen showed up, with a giant teddy bear for Emma. "You made this happen," Richard said to Margaret when they had a moment alone. "You could have made this impossible, but you gave us a chance." "No," Margaret said, shaking her head. "You're the one who made this happen. You proved you deserved to be her father. And Richard, thank you for reminding me why I do this work. Sometimes it's easy to forget that not all cases end badly." Later, after everyone had left, Richard took Emma to her room. But she stopped at the door. "Can I sleep in your room tonight?" she asked. "Just tonight, to celebrate?" "You can sleep in my room every night, if you want," Richard said. Emma grabbed her pillow and favorite blanket, and the two of them settled into Richard's room. Emma snuggled beside him, safe, loved, finally home. "Daddy," she said in the dark. "Yes, sweetheart. Do you think Mommy knows? That we won. That I'm yours now." Richard looked out the window at the stars shining over Boston. "I know she knows. And she's very, very happy." "Me too," Emma whispered. "For the first time since Mommy left, I'm happy." Richard kissed the top of her head. "Me too, Emma. Me too." And that night, for the first time in 23 years, Richard Sullivan slept in peace. Not because his losses had been erased, Caroline and Thomas would always be part of him, but because he had learned something fundamental. Life gives second chances. And when it does, you grab them with both hands and don't let go. Emma was his second chance. And he was going to make every second count. 3 years later, Christmas Eve, 2022, snow was falling softly over Boston, transforming the city into a postcard. Richard Sullivan was in the kitchen of his Beacon Hill mansion, trying to decorate Christmas cookies with icing. He had to admit, he was absolutely terrible at it. "Dad, that snowman looks like an alien," a voice said behind him, full of laughter. Richard turned and saw Emma, now 9 years old, looking at his decorating attempt with barely disguised amusement. She was wearing a ridiculous Christmas sweater he'd bought for her, complete with light-up reindeer. "It's an alien from the North Pole," Richard said, feigning seriousness. It's modern art. Emma laughed, that sound Richard never tired of hearing. Let me help before you destroy all the cookies. They worked side by side, Emma decorating with meticulous precision while Richard made his best attempt not to create more aliens. 3 years. It had been 3 years since that night in the cemetery. 3 years since everything changed. Emma had thrived beyond any expectation. She was at the top of her class at Kingsley Academy, with a special talent for math and science. She had made friends, good friends, and her confidence had grown exponentially. The nightmares still happened occasionally, but they were rare now. The scars were still there, but they were healing. And Richard had completely transformed. The cold, distant man who lived only for work no longer existed. He had reduced his responsibilities at the hospital, delegating much to capable vice presidents. Now he worked 40 hours a week, not 80, and the rest of the time was dedicated to Emma. He was president of the school's parent association. He volunteered at a homeless children's shelter, something Emma had suggested, saying she wanted to help kids like she had been. He even started therapy, finally processing the losses of Caroline and Thomas in a healthy way. Dad, Emma said as she placed the last cookie on the tray, can we go to the cemetery tomorrow? I want to take cookies to Mommy. And to your family too. Of course, Richard said, moved as he always was when Emma showed her generous heart. We'll do that in the morning, before opening presents. Emma smiled. Mommy would like to know that you take such good care of me. That you love me so much. She knew, Richard said with conviction. That's why she left me that letter. She always knew. That night, after Emma went to bed, in her own room now, a sign of how safe she felt, Richard sat in his office and opened a special drawer. Inside was Jennifer's letter, already yellowed and worn from so many readings. He didn't need to read it to remember every word. But he liked to hold it, to feel the connection with the woman who gave him the greatest gift of his life. Thank you, Jennifer, he whispered. Thank you for Emma. Thank you for believing in me when I didn't believe in myself. Thank you for giving me a reason to live again. A soft knock on the door interrupted him. Emma was there, holding her favorite teddy bear. Can't sleep? Richard asked. I was thinking, Emma said, coming in and curling up in the armchair beside him, about how everything happened. If I hadn't gone to the cemetery that night, if you hadn't gone at the same time, we never would have found each other. But we did, Richard said. Your mommy said it was always the plan. And I believe her. Me too, Emma agreed. Dad, do you still get sad? About Caroline and Thomas. Richard thought carefully. Yes, he admitted. I'll always miss them. But the sadness is different now. Before, it was a sadness that swallowed me whole. Now it's a gentle longing. Because I know they're part of my story, but it wasn't the end of it. You're the continuation, Emma. And Mommy is part of the story too, Emma said. Yes. Caroline, Thomas, Jennifer, they're all part of who we are. And it's okay to honor that. Emma got up and hugged Richard. You're the best dad in the world. I don't know what I'd do without you. And I don't know what I'd do without you, Richard replied, his voice choked up. You saved me as much as I saved you, Emma. You gave me a reason to wake up in the morning, a reason to laugh again, a reason to believe that good things can still happen. On Christmas morning, they visited the cemeteries as promised. First Jennifer's grave, where Emma placed homemade cookies and fresh flowers. Hi, Mommy, Emma said softly. I'm 9 years old now. I'm growing up a lot. And Daddy is taking such good care of me, exactly like you said he would. I love you and miss you every day. But I'm happy. And I know that's what you wanted. Then they visited Caroline and Thomas. Emma had adopted the habit of talking to them too, as if they were her extended family, which, in a way, they were. "Hi, Caroline." "Hi, Thomas," she said. "It's Christmas. Dad told me you always made cookies together. So we made some for you too." "Well, I made most of them because Dad is terrible at decorating." Richard laughed through his tears. "It's true. I really wish I could have met you," Emma continued. "But Dad tells me stories about you all the time. And I feel like, somehow, you're watching over us from up there. Thank you for sharing Daddy with me." As they left the cemetery, the same place where their story began, Richard stopped and looked back one last time. 3 years ago, he came here broken, lost, hopeless. He came to cry for the dead and had no reasons to live. But then he found Emma. Or Emma found him. Or God, the universe, fate, whatever it was, brought them together exactly when they both needed it most. "Ready to go home?" Emma asked, holding his hand. "Yes," Richard said, smiling. "Let's go home." Home. That word finally had meaning again. And as they drove back through the snow-covered streets of Boston, Richard Sullivan thought about all the losses he'd suffered, all the pain he'd endured, all the tears he'd shed. And he realized something fundamental. Pain doesn't disappear. But it can coexist with joy. Scars don't have to define you. And the love you lost doesn't make new love any less valid. Emma was his second chance. But she was also his first chance to be the father he always should have been. Present, attentive, open, loving. And this time, he was going to get it right. "I love you, Emma Rose Sullivan," Richard said as he parked in the garage. "I love you too, Dad," Emma replied. "Forever and ever. Forever and ever," Richard repeated. And for the first time in over 2 decades, Richard Sullivan was truly, completely, deeply happy. So, did it move you? Wow, what an incredible journey, right? From despair to love, from loneliness to family, from pain to hope. Richard and Emma's story shows us that it's never too late for a second chance, and that miracles happen in the most unlikely moments. If this story touched your heart, leave your like down below so more people can be moved too. Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss any emotional stories. Tell me in the comments, what part moved you the most? Have you lived through or know of a second chance story like this? Do you believe that some meetings are destiny? And it doesn't stop here. We have dozens of other stories that will make you laugh, cry, and believe in love and human goodness. Binge watch the channel. Each story is a life lesson, proof that hope never dies. A huge hug and a Merry Christmas to all of you. May each of you find your purpose, your love, your second chance. And remember, sometimes, miracles are hidden in the most unlikely places, just waiting for the right moment to reveal themselves. Until the next story.